Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Andra Gillespie. I'm the director of the James Weldon Johnson Institute. And on behalf of the staff and the visiting fellows of JWJI, I'd like to welcome you to this week's Race and Difference Colloquium series. Today, we're pleased to have Dr. Karla Slocum with us. Dr. Slocum is the Thomas Willis Lambeth Distinguished Chair of Public Policy, a professor of anthropology, and director of the Institute of African American Research at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. She's also the co-founder and co-chair of Black Communities, a conference for collaboration, which facilitates community-engaged research partnerships and exchanges. Slocum specializes in studies of place, race, history, and Black rurality, for which she has been awarded grants from the National Science Foundation, the National Endowment for the Humanities, and the School for Advanced Research. She is the author of Free Trade and Freedom, Neoliberalism, Place and Nation in the Caribbean, and Black Towns, Black Futures, the enduring allure of a Black place in the American West. Her published articles and book chapters have appeared in such journals as American Anthropologist, American Ethnologist, Transforming Anthropology, Souls, a critical journal of Black politics, culture, and society, and the Rutledge Companion on Inter-American Studies. Most recently, Slocum is the co-creator of the Tulsa Syllabus, a resource guide centering sources on and relevant to the Tulsa Race Massacre of 1921. Currently, she is pursuing a collaborative interdisciplinary project called Mapping Black Towns to digitally visualize the story of US Black settlements in their social, geographical, political, and material contexts. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Dr. Karla Slocum.
Thank you so much. I'm really delighted to be here. I've actually been paying attention to the James Weldon Johnson Institute for a little while. Interested in the kind of programming that you do. As someone who directs an institute also, I just try to pay attention to what others are doing out there. And I've always been impressed with the kinds of activities and events and scholars that you have attached to the institute. So really glad to be able to join today. I also would like to thank Andra Gillespie for inviting me today and to be part of this series, and also to thank Rhonda Patrick, who helped coordinate all of these, coordinate my participation today. And I know that anytime things like that go smoothly, it's a big help, especially in these stressful times. So I'm really grateful for that. I really want to start out my presentation today with a couple of vignettes. Let's see, I'm not getting it to advance. What am I, oh, there we go. I'm going to start with two current events, and these are headlines related to the two vignettes I'd like to talk about. First, I was actually recently interviewed by Wyoming Public Media for a story about Empire, Wyoming. It's a historic Black settlement that was formed by Black American homesteaders who came from Nebraska in 1908. They came to Wyoming in 1908. And the focus of the piece was on Empire's origins and development, but the story also mentioned both in the headline and the content that Empire had all but disappeared, as you can see by the title. An image of a desolate landscape kind of frames the story. There's a photograph, and beneath the photograph is a caption revealing that the site in the image is a cemetery. Looks pretty vacant from what you can see. You can just see a couple of crosses in the image, and the caption says it's a remnant of Empire. So the second vignette, and this will probably be known by a lot of you who are tuning in today, since it's about Georgia, is that over the summer there was news coverage of 19 Black families who had acquired close to 100 acres of land to start their own rural community called Freedom as part of their Freedom Georgia initiative. And on their website, they mentioned that their initiative was, quote, established out of an extreme sense of urgency to create a thriving safe haven for Black families in the midst of racial trauma, a global pandemic, and economic instabilities across the United States of America. They also say that they wanted to do their part, to do what they can to create safe spaces for Black people. And out of their desire, quote, out of their desire to create generational wealth for their families, they say they wanted to provide a place for restoration, recreation, and reformation for their families during this time. So as you know from this talk today, I study Black settlements in Oklahoma that are called Black towns, or sometimes referred to as all Black towns. And these were formed around the same time as Empire. and out of the same principles as freedom, some of the same principles that are mentioned in that statement by the Georgia Freedom Initiative. Empire's interesting past and absent present is a common story arc that comes up for Oklahoma's Black towns, and I would suggest other Black towns across the United States. My research has especially focused on the latter, this idea of an absent present, that when you tell these stories about Black towns, the present of the Black towns is actually absent from the narrative that you learn. And I'm interested in the 21st century significance of Black spaces like freedom and empire. I focus in my research in Oklahoma on what the present day reality of Black towns looks like beyond their past, but also inclusive of their past. So I recognize that the past has something to do with their present, but I'm also interested in that present beyond just the narrative of the past. But it's that present condition outside of preservation, outside of revering the Black town past, that tends to evade our attention most. I think Freedom Georgia gives us a chance to consider what attracts someone to engage with rural Black spaces today. And what I'd like to do in this talk is just focus on that sort of an issue. What attracts people to present day Black towns, even when there is an image of historically Black towns, like the image that's attached to that story on Empire, an image that suggests inactivity. I did ethnographic and archival research for close to a decade on Oklahoma's Black towns, and I came to the understanding that these settlements that attracted Black people to them in the late 19th century to the early 20th century still attract interest, but that present day attraction, but there is still that present day attraction. My argument is informed by work in geography, sociology, and anthropology, especially, that specifically think about the value of a Black space. And what I want to do today is to give you some background about Oklahoma's Black town settlement process, and then talk about, and the focus will really more so be on how the attraction of Black communities that are considered historically significant shows up in a variety of ways related to the town's economies. So I'm going to focus on the economic kinds of questions, although my book on this topic goes much beyond sort of the economic implications. I am focusing today on that piece. Attractions to the towns are complex and sometimes conflicting, especially in the economic realm. They range from people's imaginations about what towns' economic futures might be, to an attraction to connecting with a Black place for the chance to be part of a Black community, and there are economic implications for that. And there's also the attraction to the town's resources, that is taking advantage of the towns primarily for the purpose of profiting. So if you think about the range of those things that I just described, you're talking about connecting to a Black place for community, thinking about a Black place's future possibilities and imagining those possibilities, and then also thinking about a Black place and the profit potential from it. There's actually, I'm going to show and argue that there's a conflict within those different sorts of things, that reasons that people are attracted to a Black place and a rural Black place. On the one hand, from some who invest in Black towns, there's an emphasis on elevating and being part of Black community and elevating principles like social equity and Black economic progress. While on the other hand, from others, and especially whites who are connected to the towns, either as residents or as people who interact with the towns, they seek something purely material or political out of Black towns, and that is more of a profit motive. Trouble advancing. All right, here we go. Oklahoma's Black towns started out mostly on Indian territory. That's the slide I meant. And if you're not familiar with Indian territory, it was what we now call present day Oklahoma. And the process of Black town formation was unique on those lands. We have close to 1,000, or the numbers about how many Black towns exist in the country really sort of varies. And one of my projects is actually trying to look into that with a group of other researchers. But when you think about Black towns spread across the United States, and they really are everywhere and have been everywhere, the process that took place in what we know as present day Oklahoma was a unique one. And that's because of this area being Indian territory and Oklahoma territory at the time, and the processes that were attached to this space at that moment. So these towns were formed on lands that were settled by that were Native American lands that became available for purchase as a result of land allotments, really forced land allotments through something known as the Dawes Act. And some of the lands that became Black towns were actually allotted for Black Indian tribal members, meaning those who are called freedmen, who we call freedmen, people who had been enslaved by American Indians in the West and in this territory. And after emancipation, were also freed and acquired land as a result of this land allotment through the Dawes Act, and they started forming settlements. In the western part of the state over here, we have Oklahoma Territory. As you can see, it's written here, Oklahoma Territory. And in that space is where the Cherokee actually ceded their land to the federal government, and that land eventually became available for the land rush that many of us have read about in history books in high school. And that was also a process where some Black towns were formed as well, although the majority of Black towns tended to be in the East in this process, in this area that was known as Indian Territory. And so that is where the majority of the towns actually were formed. So the extensive use of Native American lands to settle Black towns becomes important in thinking about how the towns are conceived of today. But at their peak, Oklahoma had more than 50 Black towns. They were conceived as places where Black people could achieve freedom, or at the very least have a space for community and social and economic mobility that was denied to them elsewhere in the country. And people were beckoned with ads like these that were in Black town newspapers that circulated throughout the country, especially in the South, in the Southeast, beckoning people to be part of a Black community that was secure and safe and had certain kinds of opportunities. As you can see here in the ad, they were promising peace, happiness, and prosperity. And there were lots of ads and articles that circulated talking about the chance to be able to build a home, acquire land, and ultimately attain, as this ad prominently pronounces, freedom. So the towns that were formed were noted for having a commitment to racial uplift, being entrepreneurial. In this sense, they were influenced by the ideas of Booker T. Washington, suggesting that Black Americans in this period, again, late 1800s, early 19th century, should become economically self-sufficient and also activate businesses as a way to support themselves and energize Black communities. The towns were rural and they were small. So maximum was about 2,000 people that would have been in one of these communities at the time. And as I mentioned before, there were 50 of them. This map here by the Oklahoma Historical Society shows that shows you both the towns that existed as well as the towns that currently exist. The ones with the black stars are those that no longer exist, but once did, and the red stars are the 13 that still remain. So there are 13 that remain today, and they're still incorporated. This map also, in the course of doing my research, so I think when I started my research around 2004, they were talking about there were 30-something Black towns. And by the time I finished my research, they were calculating up to 50. It's not that new towns were discovered. It's rather more that the research was pointing to the towns and the settlements really that were not formally incorporated communities, but that were named places that still were recognized as being Black towns. And so this map actually incorporates that number of Black towns. And so in the end, the map was dotted with 50 plus Black towns, what we now know, and what we now know is Oklahoma. Among those 13, people lament the fact that about what has become, sometimes people lament what has become of their towns. And part of the reason they lament that is because part of the reason they lament that is because the towns, the 13 that remain, are very much like rural America today. In that sense, they are, sorry about that, I seem to have misplaced a page of my notes, so I'm going to try to jump in and say what I needed to say, talk without my notes. But I was mentioning that people tend to lament what has become of these. On the one hand, some people lament what has become of the towns today. And that is because the picture of Black towns today is very much like rural America writ large, regardless of the racial identity of the rural community. And that is a case of economic precarity, really, across the country, which many of us are familiar with. Or aware of. And so Black towns, the 13 that remain, are dealing with some of those sorts of dynamics in the sense that they have very few local businesses. They often have a small local clientele if they do have a local business, because local clientele also have opportunities to go to big box stores like Walmart and Target. They go online to Amazon. So there are many other options that people go to, sometimes cheaper options than their local ones. And so it's hard for a local business to be able to sustain itself. And this is one of the things that frustrates people, is that they knew that they had this active Black town past where there were a number of businesses, and they don't have those sorts of things today. But at the same time that people are frustrated by that, I'm going to suggest that there is also a way in which people are energized by the possibilities that economic precarity and that the sort of withering away of some of the strong economic base and business base that they had previously, the opportunities that presents. Skip that. One thing I wanted to point out, first of all, is just sort of to give you a contrast of the businesses the way they existed previously compared to today. So the slide that I actually just skipped over, this one about the 1930s, this is a sign that many of the Black towns have inside of them, on sort of in the center of their towns. They were signs that were put up by the Oklahoma Historical Society in the 1990s to actually mark these communities and recognize these communities. And in this text that's on here, there's sort of a text that tells you about the heyday of the communities up until 1930, just like that story about empire. And then when they get to the 1930s, they start talking about, in this sign, about the ways that the towns declined. And they talk about a decline in terms of the large outmigration, people going to urban areas elsewhere in the United States, heading further west, going to Canada, sometimes Mexico. And so the outpopulation, and then that leading subsequently to the decline in the number of establishments that were in the community, especially the economic establishments. So here in 1940 is a sociologist who, if you've read my book, is also my grandfather. I do have a personal motivation that led me to this research, and happy to talk about that during the Q&A if anyone would like. But he did some research in the 1930s and 40s, and he did sort of an accounting of 5 Black towns to show the number of businesses that are there. And this is where why I have the question mark on the previous slide, because when you look at this slide, you can still see that a town like Boley, Oklahoma, which in 1940 probably was not much more than 1,000, population 1,000, still had 62 businesses. Boley is the largest Black town in Oklahoma. Langston is the second largest. Langston had 34. You get to Rentisville and you have far fewer, but you still have 12. And Rentisville is a very tiny town. Today, the population is under 100. I don't know what it was in 1940 off the top of my head. But you can see that in the 1940s, there were still a number of businesses. And so the research that I've done suggests that this notion of a decline, it's, 1930s wasn't the end of the towns. It certainly was not the end of the towns. There was still a lot of economic vibrancy in the 1940s. But if you compare that to now, again, I'm having trouble advancing my slide. If you compare that to now, this is from 2008. These are 4 communities that I've given pseudonyms to, but they are still a range of Black towns that vary by size and in terms of population size and also land mass. And you can see that while there's variation in the number of establishments that they have, especially businesses and service institutions, that it doesn't compare to the number that you were seeing in the other slide. Now, the other slide was focused entirely on businesses. If you were to strip this current slide down to strictly businesses, what you would actually see is far fewer. You would see probably no more than two, actually three in Newtown, a restaurant, a hardware store, and a convenience mart, and and the funeral home. And then you get to Wrightsville, and you really only have one business, Freeland, one business, because these are service organizations. And then Promise actually has no businesses. And there are a number, I would say the majority of Black towns today actually do not have any businesses. So again, some people lament this and think about where they have landed compared to what they were, but there are also people who are energized by this. And that's where I wanted to talk about this idea of being attracted to the economic precarity of Black towns as an opportunity to actually do something. So the attraction of a fragile and struggling Black town economy is the chance to build it up and energize it. And I saw many examples of this: plans to create a vendor's market, town leadership trying to write grants to be able to build up the Black town business district, which would really amount to sort of one main street in the community. But there were many attempts to write grants for it. Some of them became successful in doing that. I'm getting grant awards to do that. Also, people coming up with ideas to start a convenience mart or a small sort of general store type of business. And those pop up all the time. Unfortunately, they don't sustain, they're hard to sustain, but there's still that motivation and that interest in trying to get those sorts of things going. These are very small communities, but there is a significant number of people, relatively speaking, within those communities who invest their energies into trying to energize the economies. So this is an example of a boarded up general store. And just I was mentioning before that those sorts of things actually do exist. And it's hard to go into a community today and not to see one of these businesses in this way that is boarded up or is no longer functioning. But then you will also see these efforts at trying to get something started. So I profile here somebody named Mrs. Hanson, and Mrs. Hanson, this is a quote from her. That is a pseudonym again for her, but she is somebody who started a convenience mart in a Black town. And actually hers endured for a while. And she was selling things like just sort of general, snacks and different sundries and things like that. She did sell liquor there as well. And so she had this kind of activity that was taking place in the community. But when you hear from her, she both talks about her motivation to do it, the struggles that it takes to keep the business, and then also her vision for even pushing forward. What this quote tells you is how hard the work actually is. She says she spends 3 to 4 hours going to Walmart, the very places where the clientele that don't frequent her actually go themselves. So there is that irony. She talks about filling up baskets, 3 baskets at a time, so she can fill up, so she can get in line, check that out, then go back to her car and get back in line and fill up another basket. So single-handedly, she's going to town all the time. She's going to a small city near where her town is, filling up and filling up these baskets and filling up her car with all these goods to bring back to the store. And then she caps it off by saying, I have to go to the tobacco warehouse, I have to go to the liquor warehouse, and then I have to go to 2 other warehouses to pick up supplies. And every day she says, I'm so tired and I'm thinking, what am I doing? The interesting thing about her is that she continues to do this. She actually was somebody who was involved in a lot of town organizations, and she was continuing to do this even though she had debt. She had credit card debt. So if she was able to generate some income from this work, it was not enough to get her out of debt herself. So the returns on this clearly were very small. She comments about her $4,000 credit card bill that she can't get ahead of, that she was interviewed by me. And with the money and labor required, she wonders if the store is worth it, as this quote suggested. Her interest then is in what the business does for her as someone who had a low self-esteem after she was going through a divorce with a spouse. But then she also said, after losing a spouse. And then she also said she believed having a local business, though, helped the community. And so her motivation was to try to help the community. And she talked also about, in addition to doing this business, she had dreams of doing some kind of tourist entity, tourist organization or activity as well. So she was constantly thinking. I met lots of people like her in each town who had these business ideas. Some were able to get them off the ground, others were not, but there was this constant imagination of what the economic future could be. And there was an attraction to the fact that these communities are economically fragile and vulnerable, and people constantly thinking about and imagining what they can do to change that reality. There also are a lot of town festivals. There are town reunions. There are school reunions and homecomings. There are Rentisville, which is the birthplace of John Hope Franklin, I mentioned before, one of the smallest Black towns with a very tiny population, has an annual blues festival on Labor Day weekend that brings tens of thousands of people to it. And the Boley Rodeo for the town of Boley is its biggest event, probably the biggest Black town event, maybe rivaled by the Blues Festival. They're probably around the same size and I mean, sort of attract the same size, same group numbers for their activities. And it is also an economic activity because it goes over Memorial Day weekend. So it's spread out over a couple of days, Saturday and Sunday. It attracts 20,000, close to 20,000 people in a given year. And it's a revenue generator for the towns because people come, they buy goods, they participate, they buy the tickets to go to the rodeo. So all of that is income generating for the towns. So for small towns, these big annual events like the rodeo and like the festivals are actually very important to the town's economy. And in the case of Boley, it's the town leadership, the town council and other members of this rodeo planning committee that really invest themselves in the work for this kind of an activity as something also to help keep economic possibilities and growth, economic growth possibilities for the communities. I attended a number of Blacktown rodeos, including Boley's a few times, and based on the apparent racial demographics of the crowd, as well as the kinds of social activity that I saw, it's an interesting space because I consider that the way that people who tend to participate underscores that Black community is a big draw for this. So there's the economic draw for the community leadership in part, the fact that it can generate some revenue for them, but also there's the fact that this is a big Black community kind of event. People come from all over. They come from other states. They come from urban areas. They come from all different kinds of social groups. There's a big class variation in terms of who comes to this. So it's a very Black identified event, but there's quite a range of people who partake in it. And so it's not just the economic piece of it, which is really a thread in terms of this attraction of economic attraction to a Black town. There's also the social dimension as well. I look at the weekend of the rodeo at Boley as presenting itself to the world. And what do you think that self-presentation is? It's that Boley is a Black community that is diverse and inclusive and diverse because of all the range of Black identified people that I just mentioned. And also because it incorporates a wide variety of Black people and others. This is the parade, which sort of headlines the event. It's before the actual rodeo events get started. And there are all these social clubs that march in the parade. There are high school groups, there are dance groups, there are fraternal organizations, there are sororities, there are little league clubs, there are lowriders from the urban areas, young Black males, they're bikers, they're cowboys and cowgirls. So there's just such a wide range. And think about such a small town having this variety of people that converge on it. It's once a year, so it's not frequent, but it's a major convergence for especially for the kind of town that it is. I also consider this to be a modern event, and modern because of the kinds of things that enter that space. Certainly there is the urban feature of it. There are a lot of urban participants of it, and we tend to think of urban as modern, although residents of Bowley often, and not just Bowley, residents of Black towns really push back against that a lot and want you to know that they're engaging with modern life just like everybody else. They don't want you to think about them as some kind of backwater, backward kind of rural community. And the rodeo presents that idea of modernity because into that space comes all these people who are sporting the latest fashion, carrying the latest technology, parading in the parade in these fancy cars and those sorts of things. So it's a very up-to-date kind of event as well. The interesting part of it too, though, is that you see in the backdrop, and I'm not sure if you can tell from these kinds of images, but what you can see also is that the backdrop is also these boarded up buildings. So you've got a variety of things happening in this space. You've got the economic precarity, the physical landscape that also is very challenged at the same time that you've got this very modern, active, sort of vibrant activity taking place. Prisons are also in some of the Black towns. Of the 13 Black towns, 2 of them have prisons on their soil now. There is Bowley that has 1 prison, and there is Taft, Oklahoma that has 2 prisons. The employment situation, the fragile economic status of Black towns are also a justification for prison building in these 2 towns. Prison building in Black towns is an example of how Black towns as small, economically vulnerable and racially marginal communities are cited for setting up corrections facilities. If you want to put it another way, the state of Oklahoma has been interested in, these are state prisons, the state of Oklahoma has been interested in Black towns as sites for prisons because of an existing infrastructure that the towns have and the economic fragility of the places. The latter being a common feature of towns that are identified for prison building elsewhere in the country. So in the 1980s, the state of Oklahoma placed prisons in Taft and Bowley, and with a promise of bringing employment to the communities, to local residents. This is also a common way in which when towns are cited, are explored as sites for building prisons within them or placing prisons within them, the possibilities of employment for local residents is something that often comes up, and people have these hopes for that. In the case of Bowley and Taft, that has not materialized, even though that was part of the narrative when the communities were first approached and considered for being sites for prisons. Most Black towners I talked to said that the promise of jobs for local residents in the prisons was not fulfilled. We talked to many in our interviews, my research assistants and I, we interviewed over 100 people across our research, and not specific to these particular towns, but we interviewed many people and we met very few who actually worked in one of the prisons. I would say under 5 we met who actually worked in the prisons. There is, of course, the irony also of a state prison known for disproportionate incarceration of Black Americans being built in a Black community, especially this type of Black community that prides itself on having achieved its freedom as a Black space. The additional irony is that some of the buildings in these communities in Taft and Bowley, where the prisons are housed, were once places for services that served the needs of Black Oklahomans, especially Black children. So Taft actually had an organization, an institution that was for children with special needs or disabilities, Black children, and it was a residential facility for children across the state to be able to stay. There were other sorts of facilities that were in other communities where prisons were built that were for other kinds of special needs and at-risk kinds of identifiers for Black youth. And so these buildings that were there to serve the communities or Blacks across the state, and they were transformed in the 1980s as housing facility for people incarcerated in Oklahoma. I want to be mindful of my time, so I won't get into detail that I had planned to discuss, which is really just sort of a narrative from somebody, an individual in one of the towns, about the frustration and disappointment she felt and feels about the fact that these buildings now house incarcerated people who don't interact with the communities in the ways that they did when they were these service institutions. So when they were residential facilities for Black youth in the ways that I mentioned before, the youth in those residential facilities interacted with the children in those communities. They went to the schools in those communities. So there was an interaction and an interface between them. It wasn't seen as something sort of set apart. But of course, these being prisons now, that is how they operate. You do see a few people who are incarcerated that actually work in, do some labor in the communities, but the interaction is not the same. It's not the same as sort of going to school alongside somebody or something like that. So this is where, the state has sort of an economic motivation. There is a little bit of an economic kickback for the communities in terms of taxes from the prisons, but for the most part, the economic revenue for the town, the labor, the employment opportunities are not really there substantially to make it in a way that makes a difference. The state has an interest in, sort of putting it in this kind of a community, but there's a disconnect for the community members and a frustration about it. This has actually come up recently. So this picture here is of a woman named Leila Foley Davis. She was she was the first actually Black woman mayor in the United States. And she was the mayor of Taft in the 1970s. And she's been mayor a few times in Taft. She's currently on town council, I believe. And she's quoted here talking about the fact that, for an article that talks about the fact that one of the prisons in Taft actually has a very high number of COVID cases. I think there are over 700 cases in that facility that houses under 1,000 people. So a very high proportion of the women in that prison have COVID. And here she is talking about the fact that the communities being neglected about their concern about the COVID cases. There's all kinds of protests going on around the prison currently regarding these cases, people concerned about the well-being of the women who are incarcerated, and then also people concerned about the impact on the community as well. And she's talking here again about the fact that nobody's paying attention to this for the well-being of the women or for the community. And these are the very same things she was bringing up in the 80s when they were thinking about bringing a prison to Taft in the first place. So it's very interesting to see that she was talking about the disregard for a Black community being the reason that the prison ended up there in the first place. And now she's talking about the fact that there's disregard for the community when there's this kind of health crisis going on. So whites and Black towns. Today, Black towns are actually predominantly Black, for sure. They're not 100% Black. There are people of other racial identities. If you look at the census data, that's one way to get a sense of the diversity, I suppose, or the variation in races that exist in the Black towns. But at the same time, you have to be careful a little bit about the census data. The census data, for example, count the incarcerated people who are in the prisons in the Black towns. And so that sort of skews the picture of actually who's residential and everyday life in the towns. And it increases the number of whites that are present in the census. But there still are whites who are in the towns, and really there always have been, even though they were called all Black towns, they really did always have whites in them in different sorts of ways. This is a quote from, again, Moselle Hill on his research in the 30s and 40s. And he basically talks about this pattern that he described at that time of sort of a town ethos where you have to avoid deep social interactions and intimate kinds of interactions with whites. That was sort of a town principle, a Black town principle at the time. It was fine to interact with whites economically, in business, in those sorts of ways, but interacting more intimately with them was really sort of forbidden or considered somewhat taboo. I don't consider that to be a principle that people have today based on the interviews and the research that I've done. I think this quote here from a current Black town mayor or a recent Blacktown mayor, actually frames that idea. It acknowledges that there are whites in the community, but still talks about the fact that even with whites being in the town, that doesn't mean that we're not still a Black town. And so I like this quote because she's actually saying it's about our identity, and we still are a Black town, no matter the composition of our population. However, there is something to think about here with regard to how whites are actually, what's their day-to-day life like? What is the day-to-day life like in a Black town with respect to whites who interact with the towns? And there are two ways to think about that I talk about in my book. One way is the fact that in the town center, in most Black town centers, is where you see sort of the concentration of the Black residents. And this is the town of Freeland, again, a pseudonym, and this would be the town center. This is where you're going to see, you know, sort of the main strip of the town. This is where you're going to have all the businesses or establishments that I outlined in the previous slide. They would all be concentrated here. Black towns have many churches, actually, and so the churches are always going to be in this, churches are going to be in this area as well. And then out here, you have two satellite communities. They are part of Freeland. Their formal address is Freeland, Oklahoma. There's in the zip code for Freeland, but they have place names that are informal, or they're legitimate place names, but they are for the fact, but these are unincorporated communities that are still attached to Freeland. And all Black towns, almost all Black towns have this kind of a setup where they have sort of a core Black town that is incorporated, and then these satellite communities. The satellite communities are where you're starting to see the higher proportion of whites who are moving into the towns. There are within the centers a couple of whites who live there and have lived there for a long time and are very much incorporated into everyday town life. But then out here is where the higher concentration of whites have been moving in since the 1970s and appear to be increasing in number. Their homes are larger, and they're also just physically separate from here. And so what people feel about that is, on the one hand, they're tax-paying residents, and so that brings some revenue to the communities, but there's a disparity that's happening between what I'm calling this core and this periphery. And the disparity is all about the racial, the sort of intersection of race and economics that goes on here, in terms of the fact that the people out here have the larger homes, have more land. People talk about the land beautification that also exists outside here as well, compared to what happens in the core. So this is one of the ways in which whites are settling in Black towns and kind of creating a kind of disparity that is taking place, or that has been taking place. It's actually not definitely a new phenomenon. The other way that it's happening are with people who are absentee landowners, and they are people who are buying up land. They watch the county tax records and they try to see who has defaulted on their taxes and been unable to keep up with their property taxes. And once they've been unable to do that and the land is put up for auction, somebody will purchase it and then go back to the original owner, who they know has a connection to the land. It's often land or property that's been in the family for generations, so people really want to keep their property. The person who has acquired it through these tax records, through these auctions, actually knows about that. They usually know who the person is. They'll go back to the original owner and ask them if they want to buy back the land at a higher rate. And so people kind of get into this debt relationship to these to these people who purchase lands. They're land predators, really. They're property predators, and they get into this debt relationship where they'll spend years trying to pay it off. By the time the payoff is done, I had some cases of people that we interviewed who actually said that the person was making more than 5 times what they paid for the property by doing this kind of a transaction. But with those kinds of transactions, you have some people who that's what they're doing for their own livelihood. They are watching those county records. They're binding people in these debt relationships, and they are siphoning money off from them. And that's how that's how these land predators are actually making their own money. And they, in many cases, or actually I should say in some cases, they own a majority of the land in some of these places. So that's another way in which some of the people I talked to wanted to say that you can't really think about a Black town as not having a white presence, because even if somebody isn't physically present in the town, their presence is known, their presence is palpable, because they actually have acquired this property, and they have a lot of control in the property in the community as a result of that property acquisition. I wanted to talk about the election lastly, and this is, related to what I'm talking about here, but I just also wanted to bring it a little bit current as well. So there's this sense, as we know, that rural people are voting for Donald Trump for purely economic reasons. Rural people are voting for Donald Trump for primarily, I should say, economic reasons. And the Blacktown case is actually a cause for questioning that idea, or the strict application of that idea. When considering race in rural America, the picture is actually different. Black rural America has actually not supported Donald Trump. We don't know as much. I mean, based on the news, we don't tend to learn as much about Black rural America, and we certainly don't learn about Black rural America in the West. But Black rural America has not supported Donald Trump, and this is true of Black towns as well. So Oklahoma is actually a state since 2000 that has not had any counties that have gone to a Democrat. So the entire state, the entire map has been red since 2004 in presidential elections. And that's because this picture that we get is by county. But if you break it down by precinct, you can see some pockets within those counties where there are some precincts, some areas that are voting Democratic. And in the urban areas, as you probably would expect, you can see a smattering of that in both Oklahoma City and Tulsa. And definitely there's some relationship or some connection to the Black communities in both Oklahoma City and Tulsa, where you can see those communities have definitely voted Democratic. I suspect that, I haven't looked at it that deeply, but, or I haven't looked at it extensively, but I suspect that in Oklahoma City and Tulsa, you might find some other areas that aren't uniquely Black identified or predominantly Black identified that might have gone Democratic as well. But when you go to the rural areas, what you find is this picture here. You find a pocket like a Boley. Remember how small Boley is, even though it's the largest Black town, it's still fairly small with population around 1,000. And it's surrounded by all of these Republican voting precincts within the larger county. So this is the county of Ucfuskee County. And that's really the picture that you see across the state. If I were to go to other counties where there are Black towns that have a voting precinct of their own, you would see this same kind of picture where you have a very small blue pocket in we have a very small blue pocket within a larger county that is predominantly or almost exclusively red. So on the one hand, Black towns are surrounded, right? They represent this kind of one small blip within the county. But on the other hand, what it says is that Black town folks are still going to vote, and they're still sort of having their say. And you could see where there might be an argument that they know what Oklahoma is like. They know that the state is overwhelmingly red, and they know that their vote is not going to change how Oklahoma comes out in terms of the Electoral College. But that doesn't stop them from still mobilizing to vote. And I saw that I was doing my research during the 2008 Obama election. And that's where I was able to see that people were very mobilized to be able to go and have their say and make their vote, even though they knew in the larger context of the state, it wasn't going to make a difference in terms of how the state presented. And really, Oklahoma Black towns have been politically active since their beginning. There's a historian, Melissa Stuckey, who does terrific work on actually political activism and political participation related to Black towns and the influence of Black towns on certain kinds of civil rights kind of legislation. And so that's a history of these communities. And they have stayed politically active. This photo here on the left, I mentioned that I was there in 2008 doing my research. And so here in one of these Black town festivals and parades, what do you have? You have people marching, and you have people marching with signs about voting for Obama. One thing that's interesting in this particular sign here is Rice. Andrew Rice was somebody who was running for the US Senate, and he was a young white male who was running against James Inhofe. If you know anything about Oklahoma and senators, James Inhofe has been a senator in Oklahoma for a very long time, a Republican senator for a very long time. And he just got voted back in again, I'm pretty sure. So Rice was coming up against him, and he really kind of, a lot of difficult ads, a lot of, there was a lot of, I'm blanking on an adjective, but there was a lot of fighting during this particular election, and Andrew Rice kind of took a beating in the election, with some of the advertisements against him and that sort of thing. But where did he go? I'm sure he went many places, but he showed up in a Black town to march in the parade alongside people. And like I said, I'm sure he went many places, but it was interesting that he went there to march in this particular parade. So they didn't only have his signs and support him, he was actually there and showed up. And I saw through my research over time that there were other sorts of events in Black towns where they would bring a politician in, a Democratic politician, to support a fundraising activity or some kind of activity that the towns actually really cared about. So there's been political participation in the communities, and I think we don't tend to think about Black rural communities as really having any kind of political dynamism, let alone political power. So the explanation that Donald Trump draws in rural Americans for economic reasons due to the economic precarity of rural America actually doesn't hold up, because I actually think that people are voting not strictly on economic principles, but they're voting on they're getting involved politically for other kinds of social sorts of reasons as well. And so we can't really rely on strictly an economic calculus when it comes to thinking about Donald Trump, Republicans more largely, and the connection to rural America. So just by way of wrapping up here, I just would like to say that an appeal of Black towns today is ironically their fragile economies. And what I mean by that is that many people and institutions today are drawn to Black towns to transform their economic condition or take advantage of it. However, it's important to recognize the differences among actors who are drawn to Black towns' economic potential. So there is a Mrs. Hanson who returns to the town to start a business that actually I failed to mention her father had actually started before her and had done successfully. There are others who are drawn to the town to try to start some sort of, other kind of business or activity, or think about tourism for the community. But then there are also people like the man and others who are grabbing land from poor residents and watching those town tax records. Or there's the state of Oklahoma that promotes prisons as a way to boost town economies. The picture, of course, is a mixed one then when it comes to thinking about the attraction to Black towns and related to their economic status. But we have to recognize that there is energy and that there is an attraction nonetheless, and we have to pay attention to the complexity of that attraction. Thank you very much.
So thank you. We really appreciate your talk. It's so fascinating. We have a number of questions. I'm going to start with the Q&A. If you want to ask a question, please feel free to enter it in the Q&A and I will read it for you. Our first question is from one of our new JWJI undergraduate fellows, Dominic Law. So Dominic asks, were there any significant factors or attributes that led to towns being still incorporated compared to the settlements that are no longer inhabited?
Sure, there are. The population decline is part of it. That's sort of a big one. A lot of towns lost their schools and lost other certain kinds of establishments. I didn't mention in the beginning, just due to time, that all the towns at one point had their own schools. And slowly we saw sort of a withering away of that. In the course of my research, Boley did lose its school. It was the last town to lose its own school. So losing these kinds of major establishments coupled with the population decline, those are some of the things that sort of feed into a town not being able to stay incorporated.
Thank you. So the next question is from Monica Goings. Was the decline in the 1930s due to the Great Depression and subsequently World War II?
The Great Depression was part of it. The boll weevil, so there were, I didn't also get into sort of what some of the business activities were for the communities historically. Agriculture was a big one historically. And so there was kind of an impact on agriculture through things like the Dust Bowl and the boll weevil. So those were some of the reasons. The other thing though to mention is that Oklahoma was not a state when these communities first started forming. And so not being a state, there were no state laws, there were no state Jim Crow laws. Oklahoma became a state in the early part of the 20th century after some of these communities had formed. And once that happened, some of the first laws that were passed were Jim Crow laws. So also people felt the racial hostility that they've been trying to leave for those people that had come from the South, that they were trying to get away from, actually ended up showing up in Oklahoma. And so people started leaving for those reasons too. So it really was a convergence of a variety of things that were sort of environmental, economic, and social.
Great, thank you so much. The next question is from ESW Randolph. These towns were founded as a place to do something in a capitalistic way because of an inability to do something in majority spaces. How conscious are Mrs. Hanson and other capitalists and business persons of their choice to do something through business rather than religious organizations?
Interesting. I don't know that I have a great answer for that. I think the towns have a very strong sort of foundation around business and around, the question asked about capitalist kind of organizations, capitalist kind of activities. There certainly there is that foundation around business in the communities, and people tend to think about that as a pathway for economic progress. So that definitely shows up quite a bit. But people are also really involved in church organizations too. Not, there are, I don't know if the question is asking about sort of leadership for churches or sort of churches just for kind of mobilizing people, but you see that going on simultaneously with some of the economic activities that people are doing as well. I don't know if that answers that. Yeah.
Thank you. So the next question is from Karla Roncoli. What is the current status of Black towns and their residents vis-a-vis affiliation and relationship with Native American nations?
So when I started the research, I was expecting, based on some other research, actually, I was expecting to see a lot of people who identified as freedmen or had that ancestry. And I didn't find that a lot. And I remember, what I saw was that a lot of people would talk about their, family ancestry that they knew of through sort of family histories, but very few people were actually enrolled members of American Indian tribes. And some people didn't actually see the merits of that for themselves. They didn't actually see that it was going to benefit them. So I found a lot of people who were sort of staunchly identifying as Black, even if they knew or felt that their family had a connection to American Indian tribes. So, but they're still on American Indian land in a lot of ways. And so there is that kind of a connection. if you are a member of an enrolled, if there are people in Black towns who are enrolled members of tribes, they are able to use tribal institutions and resources and services. So that can be a connection for some people as well.
Thank you. So this question is from JWJI fellow Barbara Combs, who found your talk very, very generative. So she wanted to ask, what percentage of Blacks live in rural spaces? And is the pull to spaces like Freedom, Georgia the same now as it was in the past? I'll stop there, and then there's another part to the question. I'll follow up.
I don't have that figure off the top of my head, so I'm going to have to just admit that I can't access that figure for you right now in terms of the percentage. However, I think the pull is related, but it's not entirely the same. It's funny, I started out my research kind of with that question, not so much about the pull, but just about the identifiers and the labels for the communities, whether those were sort of, carrying over 100 years later. And, obviously there is change, and so we can't expect that things are going to be exactly the same. If you look at that statement from Freedom, Georgia, I read an excerpt of it, but they very much identify things going on in the here and now. They identify COVID, they identify George Floyd's murder and police brutality and violence. So they're talking about some really current, specific kinds of dynamics that are going on that they're responding to. And so I think when we think about these communities forming, we have to think that the things that are constant are, these claims about seeking freedom, claims about seeking safety and security. Those are the kinds of things that I think are showing up sort of over time. But then the specific kinds of events and activities that lead people to seek out that kind of Black space for freedom and safety and security are going to be different.
Well, let me interject a question of my own here. What about people who leave? So especially if people who grew up in these communities, do they leave and not come back? Do they leave and maintain second homes there? When I was thinking about the predatory sort of people who were looking at tax liens, I thought about my own family. When we do have rural land, the first people who would go to try to take that land would be another relative to make sure that other people didn't get it.
Mm-hmm.
And it may be sort of a sign of privilege or anything else, but yeah, what kinds of forces are at play there? Do people who leave those communities still maintain both economic and psychic ties to place?
They absolutely do. They come back for those rodeos and parades and that sort of thing. They come back to take care of elders who are back in the community. Most people, well, I shouldn't say most, but a large percentage of people return after retirement. So they move away because, as I described, the employment opportunities locally are slim. And so they go elsewhere once they are of working age, and they might go to Kansas City, they might go to Houston. They usually go to urban areas somewhere in the Midwest or the West, and sometimes, the Southwest, like Texas. And then they will return. So they'll often make frequent returns to go visit family or just to come back, but they'll also return when they've retired. They'll set up those large homes that you're mentioning in the community, and they will stay there, for the rest of their life. So that's what people often do. People who have moved away but aren't returning still do maintain those ties. And there's sort of there are a few things that go on around that. On the one hand, there's some people who have the property, don't want to give it up, but aren't keeping the property up. And they are the real frustration for the town leadership, because you have these large tracts of land that are just overgrown with weeds and not really being taken care of. And you don't have anybody locally that's taking responsibility of it, but the property still belongs to somebody. So there's that. And then there are other people who come back and, decide to set up on that property and, retire on it or do that sort of thing. And as I mentioned before, there's some people who come back because you might have an elder parent who is ill and you come back to take care of that parent. So these are the kinds of reasons that people come back. But the return migration and the connections is very, very strong. The other thing that's strong in a sort of related way is that there are these satellite Black town communities in the places where people tend to go. So there might be sort of a Boley, San Francisco, or there might be a Langston, Houston, and they literally call themselves that. And everybody who is from Langston and happens to be in Houston, they're going to get together and socialize and stay connected.
Great, thanks. So the second part of Barbara's question was, the ad that you showed me made me think about ads that appeared in Black newspapers like the Chicago Defender that promised economic prosperity and peace in the North. But those promises were false or overstated. Can you speak a little about how these two campaigns compare and contrast?
Yeah. I know a little bit less about that campaign, so I don't know that I can speak well in a comparative kind of way. But hearing that last part of the question about the campaigns were false, I mean, they are advertisements. They are trying to attract people to move to the communities. I guess my other disclaimer is I'm not a historian. And so I've always tried to stress in my research that while I did some archival research and that sort of thing, I leave the real details about the pre-1930s period to the historians who have done that really detailed work. And I mentioned a historian earlier whose work I recommend people check out. But from what I know or what I understand is that, yes, these were advertisements. The goal was to try to build these communities up. And the way you're going to do that is by attracting people and trying to entice them to come. And so there were all kinds of activities that were done, not just in the newspapers, but also there were actually, that rodeo was 100 years old. And the first time they had that rodeo was part of this promotional kind of thing about these communities. So there are lots of ways in which they were trying to promote the communities, try to entice people to come. And once that's a feature of the work of the advertisements, then that the language in it, the ideas in it are certainly to try to, they have a goal and they're trying to meet their goal with it. I don't know that I would say that they were false, but there were certainly people who, after they got there, did feel that the security and safety that they had longed to achieve didn't materialize or didn't last long enough. And so you did see a lot of people in those same newspapers actually putting out ads that their land was now available for sale because they were leaving. And some people were going to Africa, and some people were going in all different kinds of places, planning to go to all different kinds of places that I mentioned earlier in the talk. So definitely there were people who were disillusioned early on, who felt that what they hoped to achieve in these communities didn't happen. But at the same time, there are many people who stayed and did feel that these communities, achieved something for them in terms of the social, in terms of the unity and the possibilities.
So this question is from ESW Randolph. You use the term return migration. Can you explain return migration and circular migration and their relevance in your research?
So I would think of return, also not a migration scholar, but so may not know all the different definitions of different terminologies. But for me, return migration is somebody who has migrated away from a community where they were raised or attached to, and at some point in their life, they make a return. The circular migration, my understanding is that it's, somebody who's kind of moving back and forth. They're not just, it's not just a sort of a one way, I went here and now I'm coming back. It's actually that there's a lot more movement between places. And I think if, what I can describe might be considered circular migration in the sense of there are people who come and go frequently as well. They might stay for a little while, but they're certainly coming back on an annual basis, and they're coming back on a regular basis. They may not stay for long, but they're always going to be coming back. They may come back for an event. They may come back for summers. They're all different sorts of things. I also profile in the book cases of people who migrate to for the first time in the 20th century and in the 21st century. People who either have a family connection but did not grow up and were not raised there, or may not even have a specific tie to the community, but because what the communities represent, because of what they've heard, the idea is so attractive that they decide this is the place I'm going to move to because I like what this stands for. Almost in, in a somewhat similar way to what was described for Freedom, Georgia.
Thanks. I'm going to ask another question about just thinking about politics and, just the idea of a Black controlled town. I'm assuming that the racial demographics of these communities are that Blacks actually do control the local government. But do you know anything about their relationship with state legislators? So for instance, because these Black towns exist, do they happen to have Black rural representation in the state legislature or Democratic representation? And if you know anything sort of about sort of the realignment that would have taken place in Oklahoma. So, is there any difference, or what is the difference? Since I know that there is a difference between what it would have been like when whites in Oklahoma were Democrats versus when they started to shift their party identification to the Republican Party.
Yeah. So that latter question, I'm going to defer to a historian for that one. I don't think I can answer that one knowledgeably enough. But the first question about what kind of ties they have now, there are some people who I hear have been part of Blacktown, have been engaged in Blacktown politics and have been able to move to another level. I don't think at the I don't think they're state senators, for example. There was a Blacktown member. I don't think this person had been part of Blacktown leadership, but was resident in a Blacktown and actually had been, I think, a state congressman or senator. I can't recall. So there's a little bit of that kind of minimal representation. But what I saw much more was people in Blacktown leadership just sort of engaging their state representatives on behalf of Blacktown interests. And so sort of reaching out to them for different kinds of projects or concerns that Black towns had. There are some well-connected people though in Black towns who not just engage state leadership around Blacktown issues, but also are sort of travel in those circles. So they may not be a state senator or representative, but they're known well enough. There's just a couple of individuals I can think of who are known well enough that they sort of travel in those circles and so have access.
Great, thank you. So this question is from our fellow Francine Allen. Can you talk more about who is living in these small towns? How old are they? What's their education level? Did they grow up in these towns? Are they primarily male or female? Also, are there any attempts to encourage people, especially African Americans, to move to these towns in an effort to spur their development?
Who lives in the town? So it tends to be, as I mentioned earlier, sort of they retain the features of rural America, and that's sort of an aging population. So the population tends to be older, retirement age. That doesn't mean everybody is retirement age, but a large percentage of them are. There are also school age people as well. I mean, sort of the general picture of Black towns is that, and again, not unique to Black towns, but that people move away once they are of working age, once they finish their schooling to go and find employment, and then they return at retirement age. So you have kind of this bifurcated age structure where you have a young population, old population. Doesn't mean there's nobody in their 30s, 40s, and 50s. There are, but you're going to find a much higher concentration of people in their 60s and older, and people who are 18 and younger in the community. Gender-wise, I don't know the exact percentage of gender, but it's pretty evenly split. But one thing that's interesting is that while women have always been active in Blacktown economic life, I mean, Melissa Stuckey's work shows that for historically, Blacktown leadership, with women having a role in Blacktown leadership, I would suggest is more relatively new. Is a more relatively new phenomenon. And so you have a lot of Blacktown mayors. I mean, Leila Foley Davis was one of the earliest ones. She's kind of an outlier, but there are others in more recent times who have been Blacktown mayors that are women. And you see that very much. And at one point in my research, I think I counted that the majority of Blacktown mayors were actually women. So they really, they're in town council and city council and taking these kind of leadership roles, or they're head of the Chamber of Commerce in the town or that kind of thing. So you do see a lot of women get involved. And part of that, I would argue, has to do with women returning at the, so everybody, not everybody, but people regardless of gender are returning after retirement. But because women have that caretaker role, or seen as more for that caretaker role for those elders that I mentioned, when you have sort of an elder parent that's ill and needs some care, you see women coming back for those kinds of roles more. And then when they're returning, they're getting also involved in these areas of town governance. So that's sort of who lives there. Racially, I kind of hinted at that, I guess, in what I was talking about before when I talked about the Blacks, sort of the number of whites that are there and that kind of thing. It really varies by town, and it's hard to put your finger on because are the census data, which I would argue are very skewed and inaccurate, and actually town members, town leadership also says the same thing. So it's hard to get your finger on, and as I said, it does vary by town, but they are still definitely all predominantly Black, and the majority of them are upwards of 90% Black identified. Again, recognizing though that there are some people who say they have Native American ancestry, have not formally enrolled or claimed it for a variety of reasons, and probably on the census are filling out Black or African American rather than two races or more, that sort of thing.
Great. So the next question is from Adrian Hall. In your research, did you see any kind of diaspora remittance relationship with Black towns? So for instance, people from Black towns living in cities sending money home to keep their loved ones in the towns afloat.
I didn't focus on that on my research, so I can't speak well about it, but I have a sense from the bit of research I did that people who move away are sending money back to support their elder parents, especially when elder parents are, ill and need assistance and that kind of thing. But I say that tentatively because I really did not focus that in my research. So I just really have some sort of cursory information about it.
So just to do a final call for questions, if you have any more. If there aren't any, then this is going to be the last question. And so I'm going to sort of combine it with a larger question. So this is more methodological. So one, you mentioned your personal connection to the research. So if you could talk about that and sort of the opportunities and the challenges that presents from a methodological perspective. And B. Dura asks why you use pseudonyms for selected towns.
Okay, yeah, I did mention that too. The family connection is, it's very interesting. The family connection is that my grandfather, as I mentioned, was a sociologist, and he did research in the 30s and 40s. He did his doctoral research on Black towns. Actually, he did a master's and a dissertation on Black towns. His master's was on Bowley. His dissertation was on 6 communities. He did qualitative ethnographic research as well. So that's my connection. And due to the timing of his dissertation research, my mother was a child at the time while he was living in the communities. He also, while he was writing up his dissertation, worked and taught at Langston University, the only HBCU in the town. And so they lived in Langston, and my mother as a child spent a few years of her childhood in Langston. So I grew up sort of, I can't say I grew up actually. If you see in the book, I mentioned this, that I didn't grow up learning this. I learned actually more of these stories kind of as an adult, but I did learn stories from my mother and other family members about life in these communities at that time, what they remembered. So that was part of that fed into my interest in this as a topical area. Methodologically, I don't consider myself, I got a question about this recently, I don't consider myself doing autoethnography, if that's what this question is about, because I don't consider this a story about me or about my family. I open with a narrative. I open the book with a narrative about my great uncle, who also lived in Bowley, my grandfather's brother. But besides that, I really don't spend time interrogating myself and my journey in this. So the family connection is really just sort of an admittance and a sort of opening to it. My grandfather's work, though, because he was the only sort of social scientist, there's a lot of history. If there is anything on Black towns, there's history. The historians have really dominated this research. And so as a social scientist myself, looking for social science research, his research is really very, one of the few, if not the only, certainly for that time, on Black towns. So it became very, very important to my research. And methodologically, I was, I did ethnographic research, which meant I studied, I focused on all 13. I studied all 13, but I focused on 4 in particular, and they're spread out where they are across the state. So I was, going to town council meetings, hanging out and spending time in sort of town everyday life, going to those convenience marts and restaurants and senior lunches and things like that to meet and chat with people, did formal interviews with a number of people in each community. And then I also did things like went on formalized tours of Black towns to see what the tourism industry was like, and went to the rodeos and observed what those were about. And so it was really sort of in many ways, kind of a classic ethnographic project, with a lot of observation of life, of daily life and interactions and communicating with people. I use pseudonyms because the towns are small, and I felt that it would be very easy to figure out who is who as I described people. And so I felt an interest in protecting people's identities as they told their stories. I'll be candid and say that not everybody felt concerned about that when I interviewed them. But at the same time, I felt if I was doing it for some, I should do it for all. And so I did do that. I will also admit, though, I have a sense that it frustrates some people who feel that the Blacktown story, especially the present day Blacktown story, which isn't really discussed, needs to be told, and people need to know which communities they are. So there are some people in Oklahoma who regret that I didn't name the communities so that you could know this is what goes on in this particular town, and that's documented. So that's one of the downsides, is that disappointment about that. And it's one of those times where I had to sort of negotiate sort of, some of my professional and disciplinary, perspectives with the perspectives within the community as well. It was a challenging decision.
Yeah, so I'll just follow up with that. Do your respondents, one, can they identify themselves? And then as you have presented this back in the community, can they easily pinpoint their particular communities? I mean, is that a source of some people saying you should tell our story?
I've not heard anybody say that. I've not heard anybody say that they can pinpoint which community it is. One thing that I do in the book, and I say it's in a footnote or a note, is that some aspects of the communities have been altered so that you makes it harder to figure out, because they are, again, small. If I talk about, I don't know, so-and-so's got a sewing shop and there's only one sewing shop that everybody knows, then you would figure out who it is. So there's some of those things that I altered, trying to, maintain the integrity of the information, but at the same time preserve the, the confidentiality.
Great. Well, let me think that is all the questions. Yes. So I can't hear applause, but for everyone who's here, please join me in thanking Dr. Slocum. We really appreciate it. And for next week, just so that everybody knows, our next and final talk of the semester, because of the truncated semester, because of COVID, will be next Monday. And so our speaker will be Dr. Keith Clark from George Mason University. So he's going to be talking about the life and art of Ernest J. Gaines in post-racial America. So with that, thank you very much and look forward to seeing you next week. Take care.